for LifeRing, and I try to shake it up every year. And this is what we're going to do this year. Recovering out loud. Okay, says I'm on screen share. Great. So this is the agenda. I'll just give you my out loud story very briefly, talk about the benefits and challenges of recovering out loud, options, strategies, why you might do it, self-care during the process, and then there is Q&A, but there's also interactive sections as we go along, so you don't have to wait till the end for Q&A. All right. Oops, there we go. So recovering out loud is also called open recovery. And it's really, first of all, you get to define your level of openness, which we will talk about, but it's really about being willing to share your recovery story. There are a lot of reasons for that, but part of it is just to try to make the sort of general populace of America understand better the breadth and depth of recovery stories and how many people actually are in recovery, in part to reduce stigma, but we'll talk about that a little more. I'm going to go through sort of initial decisions. I think in early recovery, we all make a choice as to who we're going to tell that we're in recovery and who we're not going to tell. But usually for most of us, this evolves over time. We often broaden the group that we're willing to share with, or we go deeper into the details that we're willing to share with groups that maybe initially just sort of had a vague understanding that we were in recovery. And then also the degree of disclosure, which is what I just mentioned, and different audiences. We may have different versions of, at work, I disclosed at this level with a acquaintance, I might disclose at this level with a close friend at this level, and those different groups sort of in our mind, this is the group, these are the rules for this group, these are the rules for that group. That can be a common approach as well. For me, I think my open recovery journey started typically, which is first I shared the details with my recovery peers, right, in rehab, in support, peer support groups. I also started therapy really early. My substance use disorder was grounded in trauma. It turned out I had PTSD and didn't know it. For good reason, I had PTSD, but I didn't realize it. For me, that showed up as anxiety, very severe. So I was in therapy, individual, and then group. My friends, a few friends knew before I went to rehab that I was going into rehab. I told them, and then some more knew as time went by. My family, initially my partner, now my husband, of course, he knew, and I told my sister. But for example, my sister happened to be living with my mother at that point in time. I did not tell my mother, but my mother was very comfortable opening my sister's mail and reading about what I was doing. So that's how it sort of got out to part of my family. Work for me, I really didn't disclose at work initially. In fact, the first time I ever disclosed to a job was when I joined the board of LifeRing, because I was a judge at the time and I had to run it through ethics. But again, you get to define the parameters, right? What I told work was that I was joining the board of LifeRing Secular Recovery. I think I had like 23 years sober at the time. And I said that 23 years sober. Because and told them what I would be doing for life, but I didn't say what drug. I was a primarily IV meth addict. I didn't say that. I'm guessing that they assumed alcohol. So I still, even when I disclosed it, I disclosed it in a certain specific way for that audience. And then, of course, a lot of us may disclose in casual conversations, right? You're on an airplane and I don't know, somehow the topic comes up. Maybe you would disclose your story there, or people that you meet in different environments. And those, I think, are sort of typical frameworks, but I went a little further at some point. I started writing about my story. So my first big public announcement was when I had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in which I admitted that I used to be a meth addict. So, and as I said, once you tell the Wall Street Journal you used to do meth, there's no coming back from that. Like that's as out as it's going to be. I later wrote an opinion piece for the Philadelphia Inquirer in which I acknowledged that I used to shoot meth. And so that was another level of disclosure. From there, I've written a number of opinion pieces, including a lot about multiple pathways and why 12 steps isn't the only way, and look at options like LifeRing, like I had pieces in Recovery Today and others, in which I usually share part of my personal story. And then my book is out. I think most of you know, From Junkie to Judge, One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction. But I also started doing public speaking. So I've spoken at like my local in my county, they have Recovery Month events. And I speak a lot at conferences. I do keynotes at like fundraisers for recovery organizations. I speak on behalf of LifeRing. I'm head of the Speakers Bureau. And I do a lot of podcasts, television, radio, and I train lawyers and judges. So I have a sort of a wide range now. As I say, I'm retired now, and so I can speak 100% openly. It's very freeing because I don't have boxes anymore about here's what I say to this group and here's what I say to that group. Now everything's out, and it's actually a very freeing, liberating, and rewarding experience. Some of the benefits of recovering out loud. Part of it can be to be understood, right? Do you want your friends and your family to really understand where you were and sort of understand what recovery means to you and your recovery process? Again, you know, you may be different levels of detail with different people, but sometimes we feel the need to share what we're going through, what our experience is, what the recovery process is. Usually a very important part of our life, and we want the people we love or care about to understand it in a more detailed way. Recovering out loud can be about connecting with your recovery peers, right? You're sharing stories with each other, which helps you feel bonded and connected to your recovery friends, your recovery peers and support groups. Can help, you know, you're validating their experience, they're validating your experience. It's a safe place to share your story. It's a place to get comfortable saying it out loud. Often it's one of the few places we've ever met people that, you know, have a lot of similar details to our story. Sometimes recovering out loud's about getting feedback, like in a LifeRing meeting. You know, you might want to ask people for suggestions or ideas, but also to see what their response is to your story. Sometimes we do it out loud for accountability, right? Some people find that sharing with friends and family that they're going to get sober, for example, can be a way to hold themselves accountable. Some people feel that it helps them be less likely to succumb again because everybody knows that they're sober, and also that the people around them might put the brakes on or give them feedback if it looks like they're in trouble. Some people recover out loud to be of service, right? I think that's a big reason that a lot of people recover out loud. They want to tell their story to be of use, to stand up for their community, to explain and educate people about what substance use disorder is, about recovery is like. And a lot of times we do it to inspire hope, right? I mean, like, let's say on an airplane, I remember sitting next to someone and I was reading my book. I think it was coming out, and the woman was asking me about it. And I told her, you know, I'm in recovery. I got, I don't know, 20 something years. And she was telling me about her daughter was struggling, and her daughter's, you know, tried to get sober and hasn't succeeded. And so my story is a story of hope. I didn't get sober till I was 32. You know, her daughter's in her 20s. And so it was another way to let her know that where her daughter is now doesn't mean she won't get well later, that, you know, I too got sober later. It can be a way to help the person struggling with the addiction to have hope, but also it can be hope for their friends and family who often feel a lot of fear and discouragement. And it can be to reduce stigma. I will say at this point in my life, I use my judge title, former judge title, honestly, as a tool to try to reduce stigma. Part of what I like to sort of stand up for, it's also why I own that I shot meth, because I really want to stand up for, you know, no matter where you are in the middle of the misery and chaos of your addiction, what your life can be like in recovery can be beautiful and productive and happy. And part of that is to try to sort of educate the public that we shouldn't give up on anyone who's struggling, that they deserve our compassion, they deserve our empathy, they deserve our help. And that is really why I use that judge title, is to just sort of get people are surprised that somebody could go from shooting meth to judge. And I can use that surprise to my advantage in helping explain to them about substance use and helping them to understand that, you know, that people are worthy of our assistance, no matter whether they're in a back room shooting meth all day like I was. And then recovering out loud, you know, can save lives. If you give people hope and that there's a way out and show them a way out, that can really be a life-changing experience. So those are my list of ideas, but I don't know whether I can see you, but I can see the chat. Does anyone have any other ideas as to what some of the benefits are of recovering out loud that you want to share? You can probably just, if you raise your hand, I might be able to see you. Any other thoughts? Did I miss something? Anna. Anna, go ahead. You have to unmute yourself.
Oh, I said all these wonderful things. I said, it's great to see you, and I've read your book. It's wonderful. So I haven't written my story, although I do enjoy writing. And for me, I think part of the benefit here would be letting go of shame. Because there was so much hiding and secrecy that surrounded my addiction, that being able to be open and vulnerable enough to share that part of myself, I have never gotten a bad reaction. If anything, I've gotten like support, and that's great. And almost everyone I have talked to either has some kind of personal experience with somebody who struggled with addiction. So shame's a big one.
That's a good point. I mean, that's sort of a subcategory of the be understood point, but you're right. Shame is something that a lot of us walk in the room with, and sort of being open about it can reduce that shame. And, and I think, personally, we should be proud of our recovery, right? A recovery is an accomplishment. Getting sober after living in that misery is hard work. And we deserve to be proud of that. And that can also help with that shame reduction. You're sort of standing up and saying, this is something I achieved, right? This is something that I worked hard for. And that can play into the shame reduction as well. But yes, good point. Pat.
Hi, maybe this just ties in with the shame thing, and you mentioned it already. For me, the big benefit is the liberation and freedom that comes with being able to talk about it. That's my big thing. Thank you.
Yes. Yes, I found that as well. My husband says I don't understand what retirement means, because of what I'm doing is clearly not full retirement, but that is one of the real reasons that I do it. All right, let's see, Daniel.
Yeah, I think Mary Beth, I've not heard your story before until today. I have to say, truthfully, it was moving. I can't thank you enough for that. I make a big point out of trying to leverage a lot of situations by telling my story or encouraging other people to feel welcome. And I think in your specific scenario, standing up and doing the right thing had to have been one of the hardest things of your life. And it helps me to put some trust in the justice system. And I think that your story has the capacity to change untold amounts of lives. And I think that if we could all learn something from it, it's that being straightforward and being honest about your situation is going to do nothing but help other people. It maybe looks dismal from the outside, but there's only one way to go sometimes, and that's up. And I can't thank you enough for this. That's the best thing I've heard all day. Sincerely, thank you very much, Mary Beth.
Thank you. And I will mention that, like, my op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, which, by the way, was called I Beat Addiction Without God, those are my website, junketadjudge.com, and they're shareable. So if you feel free to share them if you think that they would be of use. All right, we'll go on. Thank you. Those are all great. All right. So part of Recovery Out Loud, some of the things that you can talk about is not just your personal story, but it can also be about education and advocacy. I mean, I created for different workshops a number of trainings, and these are some of the topics, but these are also topics, I think, as members of LifeRing, that are particularly, near and dear to our hearts. And so part of what I actually teach about is, what is substance use disorder? People don't understand what addiction is. I go through the definitions. What's the NIDA definition or the SAMHSA definition? Continued use despite negative consequences is the basic definition. But also treatment options, like that inpatient isn't necessary for everyone. And but a lot of it's about multiple pathways. I mean, one of my main topic areas is talking about multiple pathways, about peer support options in particular, about the peer alternative study, that they're equally effective. But my point is always about choice, right? That my goal isn't to convince everyone they have to go to any particular program. My goal is to educate them that there are options so they can find the right fit and thereby have the best chance of success. The other thing is imperfect abstinence. I often, when I speak, acknowledge that like most of us, I was not perfectly abstinent from day one. And I try to dispel the myth that if you're not perfectly abstinent, you're failing. I used 3 times in my first 5 months. And one of the ways I share about that to sort of hit that home is that, if I would have been using 3 times in 5 months on a regular basis, I wouldn't have been in rehab, like that was a lot better. But it wasn't perfect, and most of us aren't. And then I talk a lot about why it's hard to stay sober in the beginning, about the brain impacts, and that it's sort of, you just don't have the skill set. It's not the habit. And I talk about that LifeRing idea about positive habit formation. You make the good positive choice over time, and how we hear about how substance use to sort of rewires your brain, but actually sobriety rewires your brain too. And again, that's sort of an encouragement thing. And I do advocacy. I talk a lot about the lack of sufficient treatment for substance use disorder. And, we talk a lot as if anybody can get treatment on demand, and that's just not true. And about different treatment options that we need. I also advocate for getting LifeRing, for example, on peer support option resources lists. Like if you guys come across a addiction resource and it has peer support and we're not on it, take the initiative and reach out to them and let them know that they should have LifeRing on there as well. So in other words, open recovery doesn't just have to be about your personal story. It can be about talking about policy and ways to better help people get to recover and to not die. The overdose epidemic, all those things. So it can be about you, your story, and your stories of use, or it can be about the broader policy issues. I read about an hour a day because I'm interviewed a lot, and I don't want to talk. I want to talk from a place of being current and up to date on all the science and all the studies and all the articles. And so I do spend about an hour a day reading those things. And by the way, if you're interested in them, I post a lot to my Twitter at Mary Beth O _. Challenges of open recovery. Oops. And here's the shame word that was mentioned earlier by Pat. One of the challenges is, just overcoming your own pain. When we share with others, a lot of times we want to be in a place where it's not going to break us down emotionally, right? That we've processed our pain, we've processed sort of what's underneath our addiction well enough that we can have sort of a more robust discussion without that strong emotional reaction. Now, don't get me wrong. If you're talking in the early stages to friends and family, the feelings that you're feeling and all that can be really useful to share. But if you're going broader than that, it can be good to be in a calmer place. Overcoming shame is a challenge, as was mentioned earlier. For a lot of us, we do feel ashamed of our actions when we were using. I did a lot of things I wasn't, I'm not proud of. I don't feel shame about them anymore, but I did in the beginning. Also, one of the challenges is that in early recovery, we're still sort of learning who we are. Right. For me, the drugs were like, a wall between me and myself. I had lost my connection to a lot of the positive sides of myself. And I really didn't even understand my own history, especially my own trauma history, because drugs had sort of muddied the water. So it can be hard to verbalize until you have gone through that process of really understanding it. One of the challenges can also be the ability to articulate your story or your message well. I will mention, by the way, that I am head of the LifeRing Speakers Bureau. And if anyone's ever interested in publicly telling their story, I actually will work with you to do that, practice with you, give you an outline, that kind of thing. So that's a resource that's available. But also part of telling the story before I went public, like before I spoke in any event, I'm an outliner. I had a bullet point outline. I practiced it and practiced it. And I had the outline with me, but I practiced it enough that I was comfortable, and also that I didn't need to stare at the piece of paper. But thinking about what message am I trying to send? What are my sort of top points? What's my elevator pitch, as they would say? What's the short version that you want to get across? What are the main aspects of myself, what I want to share? What are the main aspects of issues related to addiction or recovery that I want to talk about? One of the challenges can be, if you go public online in any way, is the damn online trolls. When my Wall Street Journal piece was out, by the way, I submitted it to the Wall Street Journal opinion editor, and Wall Street Journal chose to put it in the religion column. Okay, so they chose to put I beat addiction without God in the religion column because they wanted to have a lot of controversy. And so 75% of the comments were negative. They were either really mad that I would suggest that there was anything other than 12 steps, or they were really mad that somebody who shot meth was even allowed to ever become a judge. And so it was, my friends had warned me, don't get into a discussion with them, don't respond, but I did read them. And after the first one, I stopped reading, because it wasn't a substantive discussion of the issue, it was just attacks. And so if you're going to go public online in that way, you have to think about that. Even if you're on Twitter and you're saying personal things, you have to be ready. Not everybody's happy with what you say. There can just be a fear of public speaking, right? Not everybody's comfortable speaking out in public. And depending on the audience, that can happen. But there are ways, there are techniques that could alleviate that, which I'm again happy to work with you on. Finding opportunities to tell your story. Maybe you're ready. Maybe you want to share it beyond your peer support group or beyond your friends and family. How do you find opportunities to share your story where your story could be of use? And so, for example, Recovery Month in September, a lot of local communities have events, and that can be one thing. What's happening in my local community in September? Or reaching out to recovery houses, or I know a lot of podcasts I could suggest that you submit to if you're interested in doing that. Do you want to write, or would you rather do something where you're speaking? There are a lot of different options, but it does, I spend, probably an hour a day marketing myself too, submitting here, submitting there. My book came out in January of 2023, and counting podcasts, I did 123 speaking engagements in 2023, 123, of which I guarantee you LifeRing, I brought up at least 2/3 of the time, and sometimes extensively, depending on the format and who I was talking with. But it can take work. If you want to sort of be of service in this way, it can take work to find opportunities. Any other thoughts about challenges that you think might be sort of obstacles to you sharing your story? Not necessarily like Wall Street Journal level sharing, but just sharing your story more broadly than you're doing today. Okay, well, I guess I covered it all, but we'll go on. Okay, risks. So we'll go through risk and benefits. We're not just going to focus on the risks, just so you know. But people do fear that they're going to be judged, right? I know people judge me for shooting up. Like, shooting meth is, is sort of, even within drug use, is at the sort of the most despised level of the hierarchy. And that's just the way it is. I don't really worry about that. Some people worry that if they share their story, even with friends or family, that they might lose some relationships, or that the relationships will be negatively impacted. People certainly worry about work finding out. A lot of people are concerned about, people finding out at work. They worry about their reputation being impacted. One of the things about work is, there's usually a number of people, and you don't know how everyone's going to react. And also, once you come out at work, you really can't take that back. It'll be out forever. So it's a big decision about whether or not to share at work. Even medical records. I know people don't sometimes tell their medical providers that they're in recovery, because once it's in your medical records, it can sort of follow you around. And so even saying that can be a big decision. People worry about being tagged with that addict label forever. In LifeRing, we don't require that people identify as addict, but that's sort of the general terminology. It's not the preferred terminology. Preferred terminology is person with a substance use disorder, but it is out there, and people do worry about having that label on them. People might worry if they tell friends or family or others that they're going to sort of lose control of the narrative, right? What you said, or you may have put context around it when you talk to, let's say, your aunt, but maybe your aunt shares it with your grandmother, and it's just presented in a very different way. And so loss of that narrative can be a concern. but also losing control over who knows. I mean, if you go out to the Wall Street Journal, I have completely lost control over who knows. But even if you tell friends or family, sometimes, you know, people talk, and sometimes you know that it might, people might know beyond the group that you personally shared it with. And so that can be something to think about. It's a risk to consider. Any other risks that I didn't include that have people have thought about? Lisa?
Yes. Am I unmuted? Okay.
You're unmuted now.
Okay. Well, it's not really, I guess, one, it was fear of being judged, but sort of secondhand. As some of you know, I recently lost my mother. She battled cancer and horrible chemo experience. She was on a lot of pain meds. I bit my tongue so many times because I'm used to being a lot more open with medical professionals. You know, I'd have a nurse visiting and be like in a LifeRing, like business meeting or something. But so I kept finding myself biting my tongue, but that was my fear that it would negatively impact her treatment, and that they would be concerned about all these medications that were in the house. And I couldn't risk that, so it was a weird experience, because for many years I was just automatic, and I kept having to like choke it down.
I can understand why you had that fear. I think that's really interesting to bring up with the group, and perfectly understandable. Because the truth is, even the medical profession often stigmatizes people who use drugs, and it's an ongoing problem. They don't always understand it to the level that they should. And yeah, that's that. I'm glad you shared that, Lisa. That's sort of an interesting nuance to it, but I can absolutely understand why you have those concerns. All right, let's see. Okay, so I sort of hit on this, but this is sort of the different groups. As I mentioned, some people sort of put what they share with into sort of certain categories. With recovery peers, I'll share this. But is it going to be meetings only, or like in general? With friends, are you going to tell everybody or just some? Are you going to tell them all at once, or sort of space it out over time? Are you going to tell them all the same thing, or some people get a more narrow version, a more limited version of it? Family, things to think about. Can they keep it to themselves? Or who might, like I said, I wrote a letter to my sister. I thought that was safe. It wasn't. I knew my mother. I don't know what I was thinking. I should have known that letter wasn't making it through to my sister unopened. But yeah. Coworkers, right? Some coworkers become friends? Do you feel comfortable telling your coworker friends? Or what about going to HR if you need to go to treatment? I mean, sometimes, by the way, the Americans with Disabilities Act actually protects you with getting treatment when you're working. So you might, if people are in active addiction and they want to get help, they may have to go to HR or something to get leave. So there's that. Medical professionals, that can be a concern. Are they going to type in, addict in your records, and then if you legitimately need pain management 10 years from now, it's going to be a problem? On the other hand, it can be important information for your doctor to share. I share with my doctors. They try to give me pain meds. I always ask them, is there a non-narcotic option? Is there a non-narcotic option? And often I don't take it if I don't think I need it, or I take one the first day, and the rest of the bottle I toss when it expires. The public, right? That's a whole different level. And most of us don't do public, but you might, there's like big public and there's more narrow. Would you be willing to speak at a Recovery Month event in your local community? That's a limited public exposure. Has anybody, approached this in different ways, or want to share anything about how they tackled who they were going to share their recovery with, or their substance use disorder with, and how that turned out? All right, we'll go on. Okay, so part of it is this, before you go like more public, I think it'd be good to do a self-analysis, just like sort of like with our workbook, right? Let's think this through, let's analyze it, let's write it up. Like, what would Recovering Out Loud mean to you? When you think about, I would actually like to recover more out loud, what exactly do you mean? And what are you thinking about as far as the reasons for it? Why is it important to you? Why would you like to share your story? What would be the purpose of sharing your story? Because that purpose can impact with whom you might want to share it, and also in what format, and also at what level of specificity. Pat raised her hand. Yes, Pat.
Sorry, I'd just like to, in answer to your question a minute ago, a few years ago, I'm with LifeRing in Ireland, and we were opening up a new meeting outside Dublin. So I agreed to do an interview with I sought to do an interview with the local radio station. And I suppose the unintended consequence of that was that I sent a link to the various people in my family to that interview. And many of them did not know about my involvement in LifeRing in the first place. And I got an enormous positive response, which I wasn't expecting. So that's just my experience of saying out loud that I'm in LifeRing and a bit about my history.
Oh, that's lovely. And you're right. A lot of times it is positive. I mean, when my book came out, I had former coworkers writing to me about how brave I was to tell my story. And a lot of my former coworkers, when I hear from them, mostly it's because they want advice and guidance because someone they love is struggling. And that's a very rewarding engagement. I will also mention to you, by the way, I was on the Two Norries podcast in Ireland. And
yeah, that's right.
if you're interested in that, I have their emails. Just send me a message. All right, Linda.
Yeah. When I started recovering, I decided to tell everybody. So I just went for it because I wanted to tell my own story and have control over at least that part of it. If people talked about me, at least they knew from my side everything. And I was really comfortable with that. And I got amazing support. Everybody called me, stays in touch with me. Grammar school friends people I had in grammar school came back and started talking to me again, that had been away for a while. So it was really an amazing experience. And I'm glad I just went for it. I have no regrets about that.
That's lovely. It isn't interesting. Can you unmute yourself, Linda? I think it's echoing. It is an interesting point that sometimes actually sharing that we're going into recovery can get back relationships that we had lost because we were in active addiction, right? And so it can be a way to start to repair the relationship, which is part of what Linda was talking about. That's a very good point. All right, so Renee.
I was just going to say that with regard to workplaces, you have to be selective because some workplaces can be, I don't know the best way to put it, but antagonistic about revealing personal things like that about yourself. So
you're right. I mean, sometimes when I say, well, I didn't share with my workplace that I was in recovery. I didn't share with them that I had been raped either. You know what I mean? Like for me, it was sort of all in the same box. That was my attitude toward it. But different people feel differently, or they're in a different type of workplace, and so it can really vary. It's an individual decision. And before you share work, I just always encourage people to really think hard about it. Fred.
Yeah, I started out sharing it, and I got slammed. One of my best friends just completely turned on me and became actually kind of vicious. And I realized after I started processing with my psychiatrist that my friend was suffering from an eating disorder and was very threatened by my openness and my self-confidence and self-respect, which she had very little of. And I realized I needed to be very careful because I also had some pretty brutal in-laws who I knew if they found out, it would be the end of me having an enjoyable time with them. Particularly one, my brother-in-law, was just a mean son of a bitch. And I knew that if he found out about it, it would never go away. It would always be a part of his whatever he was dealing with. So I took a very conservative approach at that point, and I decided that I was only going to share it where it was a benefit to me and the other person. That meant I started only sharing with people who had some experience with it, who might benefit from it, and that I trusted enough that I would know that they would respect my anonymity. So I became very, very careful about it because it came back so badly. I had a few people who were very supportive right at the front end, but enough really traumatic experiences that I realized if I'm telling somebody that I have this issue or had this issue, I'm throwing out a barometer of their understanding of the problem itself. And that some people were going to be threatened by it. And so I decided to get very conservative about it.
Thank you, Fred. I mean, the other thing, and I have a slide on this afterward, is the self-care aspect, to be ready for the consequences. And that's one thing we'll talk about, you know, later in the presentation. You really do need to think that all the discussions may not go, you know, perfectly or emotionally supportive. And so self-care is definitely a part of the consideration. Laura.
Hi, appreciate you being here, Mary Beth. I've always found, at least in early sobriety for me, what helped was the go slow, test out the waters. There's something usually, you know, about addiction or alcohol use or something that comes up or that I can ease into. How do they feel about the subject? You know, and then I might share a little bit about, I know some people. So, you know, that's how now I'm open with pretty much anybody. But at first I was very, very slow. Just see how they feel about it, you know, find out, and then I would go further. And then if that went okay, then I'd go further. So if that helps anybody, it doesn't have to be a fully out or a fully hidden.
Exactly right. I mean, that's a good point. And that's why I talk about, you know, the level of disclosure, right? But you're right. You could test the waters by not even mentioning yourself and starting out with it as a general topic. I read a story about whatever. Thank you all. I appreciate the participation. Sue, I want to come back to you in just a second. So I just want to go through the rest of the slide. What healing might be available to you and others as the result of sharing? So for example, are you sharing in order to encourage someone else to get help, or for their friends and family to know what options are? What challenges may you encounter? We've heard some of those. What might you learn about yourself as you make these recovering out loud decisions? I mean, just thinking about it can really help you notice, you know what, I'm actually still feeling a bit of shame about this, or actually this part of it would be hard for me to share. Why is that? And then who can support you throughout the process? It can be really good to have emotional support if all the conversations don't go well. Especially if there are conversations that you feel you have to have, like maybe with a family member, but you know that they're not going to respond the way you would wish. And part of what we just talked about was different types of disclosures, right? Individual conversations, one-on-ones, being part of maybe a broader group discussion. I don't know if it comes up at Thanksgiving. Do you want to have a broader discussion about what recovery options there are, or LifeRing is a great program, or different personal challenges that you had? They're speaking at a meeting. Some people journal, and there are actually groups where they shared their journals, which can be a way of sharing, you know, at a really deep emotional level. Public writings, as I, you know, mentioned, you can do it in your local newspaper. You can do it a blog. You can do a Wall Street Journal piece. There's all kinds of ways to do public writings. Public speaking, a wide variety of opportunities at different levels. And then does anyone have any experiences so far with disclosures beyond sort of the one-on-one family or friends level, or any interest in the future? And while you're thinking about that, Sue had something a point she wanted to make.
Oh, I just wanted to say that what Fred said about his family, people using your recovery as a tool, a negative tool, that's heartbreaking. And I'm afraid it happens all the time. And it's then I would be very cautious. Personally, bringing something like that forward for work. Just what if I actually have a sick day? I need to have a sick day. I know I'd be going into work because I would be worried they would be thinking, oh, she's got a hangover, right? But I wanted to say also that I was very proud to bring my recovery to my friends. And I didn't have a single one of them look at me a scamp, because, you know, they had dealt with me when I was not sober, and they were like, right on, how can I help you? Where do you want me to drive you? Like it was a time for joyous celebration for them. And I hope that in your experiences, as if you haven't gone through this process yet, that you have the same positive response that Pat got, surprisingly, and that I received as well. So I love this. I love what you're doing here, Mary Beth. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All very good. I mean, I had one bad experience as well, but it wasn't someone, you know, so it just told me who she was, you know, like once she reacted like that, like, okay, well, now I know who you are. And now you are like an acquaintance and no longer a friend. Strategies, okay, and techniques. So part of the strategy that you're going to take can depend on sort of what is your goal, you know. Are you trying to get people to understand, your friends and family to understand you individually, what your process is like, maybe even understand why you turned to substances in the first place, why excessive use was actually appealing to you? Do they know what's sort of underneath it? It can be a way to share that. And then with this strategy, it's like similarly, who is the audience? That's related. But then also, what are you willing to share? And as a number of the people who have commented mentioned, you know, there's choice. You have choice. Are you going to share about your story in general? Are you going to give specifics about your drug use? Are you going to give specifics about your recovery? Any details about any underlying trauma or mental health conditions? I mean, I will say, when I say sober, and I say sober and not clean just because that's the modern terminology, but but at the same time, sober, actually, there's an implicit suggestion to people who aren't in the recovery field that I mean alcohol. When I don't, it's just that that's the modern term for sober from any of the drugs, but it can give me cover sometimes. I could say sober if I don't want to share what my drug of choice was or that I shot it. It's sort of, I could talk about the general issue of addiction and recovery without being specific, and sometimes turning people off because I shot meth and now they sort of, you know, can't hear anything else I say because they're looking at me thinking, you know, well, anyway, are you willing to share in a confidential way only? You know, you're talking with someone, but you want them to keep it confidential, or are you willing to go more public? And is it written or verbal? Then with techniques, writing, you know, there are recovery publications. I mean, even if you're in, like, let's say Recovery Today, I had a piece, that's a different reader audience, right? I mean, first of all, Mary Beth O'Connor is actually not that unusual a name. There are other Mary Beth O'Connors. Okay, so and for most of us, that's true. But when you write for the Recovery Today, you have a certain audience who understands addiction and recovery. When you write for the Wall Street Journal, you have a much different audience, and so part of it can depend on the feedback that you get and also what you're trying to share. There's a, you know, the goal might be different when sharing in the recovery community than when sharing in the general population. Sometimes the goals are the same and sometimes they're different, and sometimes the arguments or discussion points will be different. When you're speaking, if you're going to speak, think about, let's say you're going to do a Recovery Month event. You know, what's going to work for you? Do you want to do an outline? I do a bullet point outline for myself. I always take it, even when I know my LifeRing presentation, I take it just to glance down and make sure I didn't forget something, but it's just bullet points. Or do you like to write it all out? Do you want to practice alone? Do you want to practice with others and get feedback? It can be really helpful if you're going to speak publicly to record yourself and then watch it. You know, I've done that on Zoom. I've recorded myself. You notice different things like, oh, I say this phrase a lot or whatever. Not that you have to be hyper worried about that on the audience, but it can, or also just, you know, how do I look? Do I look relaxed? Am I looking ahead? You know, all those kind of things. So it can make you more confident as well to see yourself recorded, because you'll see, oh, you know what? Actually, I do look, you know, like fairly smooth. I'm actually doing a pretty good job of making my major points. The other thing about speaking is, it doesn't have to be perfect. I mean, just, you know, you will get your major points across, and you will sometimes forget to say one or two things, or like in a Q&A, I get, you know, sometimes I think of a better answer after I left, but that's okay because I'll probably get asked that question again, and now I have a better answer. So it's never going to be perfect. Handling Q&A. So I think what's most important if you're going to have a Q&A is that you're comfortable sort of maintaining your composure. In other words, you're not going to get triggered emotionally by the question or if somebody challenges you. I mean, sometimes I get challenged by 12-step people, and, you know, I can answer them in a neutral way. You know, I support 12 steps when it's the right fit, but, you know, but it's not the right fit for everyone, and we need to make sure people know they have choice or whatever it is. I don't, they can challenge me and I don't have an emotional reaction, and that can be a good place to be. Or if you do have an emotional reaction, just pause, take a deep breath, you know, take a deep breath before you respond. There's techniques. Handling Q&A can be actively listening. Sometimes the point people can wander, you know, and so sort of trying to get to the gist of what's their main point, and I'll phrase it like that. What I think your main point is this, and then I'll answer it. You can pause and reflect in Q&A. You don't have to give an answer like snap, snap, snap. Sometimes you want to think about it for a second, and that's okay. Maintaining eye contact helps with Q&A. It shows you're listening to them, and so they're going to feel heard just from your body language when you're paying close attention. I think it can be good to anticipate common questions. I mean, when I was a judge, what I think the judge is going to ask me, I'm going to think about what my answer is going to be to that, and it can be the same in the Q&A. I have a list in my training about the LifeRing, LifeRing nuts and bolts training I created. In that, if you're going to do one, I have a common questions and an answer, like, do you have sponsors? You know, I have an answer to that. And so anticipating questions that might come up, or if you do it once and then somebody asks a question I didn't anticipate, when I get home, I add it to my list so that, you know, I'm ready next time. Rehearsing your responses and doing a dry run can be helpful too. Maybe do it with a non-recovery person and see what questions they might have after you do your presentation. It can help. You can have a really important impact by doing a speaking engagement. Your ability to communicate what you want, what you think is most important, what your priority points are effectively, it really can have a lasting impact on audiences. I get messages, you know, people can message me through my website and I get them afterward. You really made me think about this, or I feel so much more hope about my cousin or my sister or whatever it might be. You don't always, you know, you have a bigger impact than is going to come to your direct attention. You sort of get it through sort of side indicators. Effectively communicating isn't just about delivering the message, but also resonating with the experiences, values, and emotions of those listening. So I really try to scan the audience. Does it look like they're paying attention? Do I need to slow down? Are they looking at all confused, or is there attention wandering? But also, again, in that Q&A, really making them know that I'm listening to them and I'm doing my best to respond to their feedback, their point, their question. And then standards can be different for casual conversations and formal presentation. I will say one of the reasons I use PowerPoints for a lot of my presentations, it's not that I don't know the material, it's that it's an outline for me. But it also gives the audience something to look at, but it keeps me on track. And so when I do I created a continuing legal education training for lawyers and judges, in which I go through what is substance use and treatment options and peer support groups and why it's important to offer choice. And I tell them what's going wrong with the legal system as far as like mandating 12 steps only and expecting perfect absence and things. But my outline is there mostly. My PowerPoint helps me stay on track. And so think about sometimes the tool, it's visual for the audience. Like you see, I try to put some graphics in so it looks, you know, a little interesting, but it also can be helpful to you because you've got an outline. It's sort of a hidden outline. And why do we do it? Sharing your story can provide hope, because those still struggling can relate to your past and hear solutions that might work for them. Hope for friends and family, sort of normalizes the challenges, obstacles, mistakes. Like I tell about how, you know, I was 32 when I got sober. I was young. I felt like I had like lost all my life. Like, you know, I was ancient. Things were never going to, they get better, but not that much better. All the sort of normal challenges and obstacles so that other people in early recovery understand that it's normal what they're feeling. And highlighting your strengths and your milestones in recovery can provide inspiration for those who are struggling. I had 30 years of sobriety in January, and that, you know, can be a real reassurer to people. I shot meth until I was 32, and now I've got 30 years of sobriety. So that can help. And then, as I mentioned, self-care. So think about, you know, preparing so that you're ready, that you're that you feel as comfortable as you can. Think about on the day that you will speak. Do you need a friend with you? Do you want to do a meditation beforehand to sort of relax yourself? Do you want to practice beforehand? But then afterward, do you have someone who will support you, who you can call if you got triggered by the event or by any of the questions or by the response? It can be friends or family. It can be your recovery peers, a coach, a therapist, anyone that's going to be able to help you deal with the emotions that might come up from sharing. All right. And I'm almost out of my, I am over my 45. Yeah, maybe I am. I can't remember if I started at 101:15, but this is my contact info, but also I'm LifeRing. So Mary Beth at LifeRing.org.